Welcome back. Well, I thought we'd do something a little different today. I always end up saying that because I'm always trying to see what we can do that's a little different, that will shake things up. I've got Audie here with me. Wait, pick your little face up so I can see you. There you go. He just came in. And whenever he comes in, he has to spend time in my lap to make sure I missed him. It's like that's his thing. So when we get back, we're going to talk about grammar in a minute. So we've been having a lot of fun with words lately, with grammar. We're playing around with our words, and it's self-improvement. And self-improvement is always a good thing, especially if we can improve ourselves in ways that pay off. And grammar is one of those ways that really pays off. Everybody told us this when we were young children. So, well, people are going to judge you by your grammar. Most of us didn't listen, but trust me, they were right. People do judge you by how you speak. If you speak well, people will listen to you, and they will give you more respect than if you don't speak well. And we don't want anybody looking down their noses at us, thank you very much. We want to be the ones looking down our noses at everybody else. So, grammar is important. It really is. When you're a young person, just starting out your life as a young adult, it can be the difference between getting a job and not getting a job. It can be the difference between getting a promotion and not getting a promotion. It can be the difference between attracting a good potential spouse and attracting a lesser potential spouse, because people will judge you on your grammar. So I consider it important. But there's a lot of grammar rules that I don't consider important. And the reason we have these rules is several hundred years ago, a couple of English bishops, and this is it. These were English bishops. These were not educators. They were not linguists. They were bishops. Decided they were going to force English to conform to the rules of Latin. Because Latin had a whole bunch of rules, and English, although obviously it has rules, all languages have rules, they were not formalized. They were not written down. Some languages take this really seriously. If you go to France, they actually have academic people who decide what is proper French and what is not. So, geez, if you like your grammar and you like correcting people's grammar, learn French. It's like they practically give you a badge for it. But we have a language that changes, and that's the history of English. It changes all the time. English started off as a Proto-Germanic. It's still a Germanic language, but it started off as a Proto-Germanic language that was influenced heavily by Viking invasions of England. You got to remember, England is the size of a postage stamp, and this is where our language came from. 30, I looked this up once, 30 of the American states, which is pretty much every state west of the Mississippi, is bigger than England. You could drop England in most of those states and they wouldn't even notice. It's roughly the size of my state, Pennsylvania, roughly. It's this big. Vikings came in and they did their thing, and they simplified our language and gave us a few Viking quirks, so that if you speak Icelandic, for example, you're speaking pretty much the same language that was spoken in your country 1,000, 1,500 years ago. Icelandic people can read the Old Norse sagas the way we read Shakespeare. In other words, some things are opaque to them, but most of it is perfectly understandable. Again, we look at Shakespeare, and that's just a few hundred years old, and say, I'm having trouble with this. Most of us really stumble on Chaucer, which is really, that's not even Old English. Our language has changed a lot. Some Scandinavians came in, they sprinkled their grammar and their vocabulary in. The French came in, did likewise. We are a language that borrows heavily. And I've heard people, there was one linguist who made a joke and said, why do they say we borrowed it? It's not like we're going to give it back. He's right, we're not giving it back. We have just absorbed other people's language, made it our own. We've incorporated it into English. Our language is always changing, but we went a very long time without formal rules, and a couple of bishops decided we needed formal rules, and they decided that Latin was a good prototype. So we have rules like you can't end a sentence on a preposition. In other words, what's up is not a legitimate sentence. I like to quote Winston Churchill on that one, because in response to a comment on ending a sentence on a preposition, Winston Churchill allegedly said, I don't know if this is true or apocryphal, but allegedly he said, that is something up with which I shall not put, pointing out the absurdity of such a rule. I'm sure most grammar mavens know about the whole to boldly go where no man has gone before. That's not proper English, but that's English. And no matter how many different ways you phrase it, you gotta know they put it out there in the best possible way. Those, yes, I got your tail, those are foolish rules. English is not Latin. Latin might have been thought of by a few bishops as like the perfect language. In my opinion, it's a long way from perfect. But then again, I'm prejudiced. I like my own language. But some rules do make sense. Those are the ones we're going to talk about, because I'm not going to say, oh no, you cannot split an infinitive. You cannot end on a preposition. You cannot use the word hopefully, meaning I hope, because we all do that. No. But can you say me and Johnny went to the store? Well, yes and no. Yes, you can say it and people will understand you. No, you can't say it and be taken seriously. That's the sort of thing a small child says. Me and Johnny went to the store. We don't consider that to be something that a well-educated adult says. And why is that? What's the deal with me and Johnny? And we've got two errors there. First error is direct object, indirect object. Me is the indirect object. It should be I and Johnny went to the store to correct that error. But then we have the second error coming in, which is you always put the other person first and yourself last in order. It has to be Johnny and I went to the store. Usually we understand this intuitively if we dump Johnny. Me and Johnny went to the store. No, Why? Because me went to the store is not how you say it. And that's because when we start forming sentences, we understand, we learn from a very early age that that direct object, me, well, I am the direct object. I'm the one we're talking about. And me, the indirect object, are two different things. When it's I'm doing something. When it's me, something is being done to me. So, Johnny went to the store with me. Yes. Me and Johnny went to the store. No. Pull Johnny out. Me went to the store. That's how you can differentiate between the direct object and the indirect object. Those errors almost always happen when you are talking about I or me and someone else. Pull that someone else out of the sentence. That will almost always immediately correct the sentence for you. Super, super easy. So let's talk about another one. This one crops up on things like the SATs or even things like the high school equivalency, the GED exams. It often crops up on tests of English as a second language, although really it shouldn't. But it's an interesting one. It's not important. It's a distinction without a difference, but it always crops up. I don't know why. It's a favorite of test writers. What is the difference between one another and each other? We love each other. We love one another. What do they mean? By definition, each other refers to two people. The reason they apply each other is because there's an implication of reciprocity. I love you, you love me. That means two people. We all like one another more than two people. Not sure why. The same rule should apply if you reason it out. We all like one another means that every person in that group likes every other person in that group, hence reciprocity. So why is one another okay for more than two people, but not okay for two people? Why don't we all, the five of us, like each other? Arbitrary rule. Not sure how or why this one came about. This is one you just have to memorize because it's one that people get tested on. High school kids get tested on it for the SATs. Adult learners looking for a GED get tested on it, on that exam. People who come into the U.S. speaking English as a second language get tested on it. We just have to memorize that one. That's why that one is important. As I say, it is so ubiquitous. It might as well be write your name on the test and then deal with each other, one another. Seriously, it's all over the place. So you memorize it. And you simply use the rule. Each other is two. One another is three or more. And you just have to memorize it. The mnemonic I used, which isn't much of a mnemonic, is simply there are more letters in one another. Therefore, more people. Each other is two. One another has more letters. Which should trigger the idea of more people. Again, memorize it. It's all you can do. But there is another one that I wanted to talk about. And this is one that is, again, we've got like an arbitrary sort of rule here, but it's an old rule. And that is ask, acts. That's something called metathesis. I always have to be careful how I say that. Metathesis means transposing letters. Metastasis, of course, means turning it into cancer. And that's where I always want to say metastasis. And that is just because it's sort of a little inside joke for me that eventually that whole concept of metathesis turned into like this sociolinguistic cancer, because ask, acts became linked to racial groups and to socioeconomic divisions in inner cities like New York, where you hear a lot of that. So why do I find this so funny? Because in reality, acts is probably what the word really should be. Way back, 1,000 years ago, when we were still dealing with, well, actually, no, it's more than 1,500 years ago, there we go, when we were still dealing with Old English and just beginning to commit the language to paper. The word was axion or askion, just both. Scholars think axion was the original word. So when we dropped the ending, should have been ax, right? Not ask. But metathesis took over, and the S and K got flipped. And they went back and forth, by the way, for a long time. Ax was perfectly acceptable, so was ask. And they, in some manuscripts, they actually have ax and ask written in the same manuscript, which is really interesting, I think. So why is this such a big deal? I don't know. We have examples of metathesis all the time. And the easy one, the one everybody knows, because we use examples of this virtually every day. 1, 2, 3. First, second, not threed, third. We flipped it. Metathesis. 3 became third. It's not thrid, you know. Bird is another one that came through that way. At one time, it had been a little brid flying around, and then eventually became bird. We have a lot of other examples. The WH started off as HW. That's an interesting one, because if you listen to the way people who pronounce WH, they pronounce that H, drives me crazy when I hear that. I always just want to say, for heaven's sake, it's just a W sound. If you listen closely, they're really not saying WH. They're really saying HW. It's more what, and the H is coming first. That's an old English consonant combination. Yes, all right, baby. And he's shaking the camera again because he wants more attention. So we have a whole world of grammatical errors, grammatical rules. There's a lot that we have. And we can spend time unpacking this, pulling it apart, talking about where these rules came from, how many of them should we really pay attention to, how many of them can we afford to slough off. I'm living in South Central Pennsylvania. I've spoken about this. And around here, people say things like that needs washed. I had never actually heard anybody say that in my life until I came to this area. It's obvious what it means. That needs washed. I would say that needs to be washed. But my way of saying it is more cumbersome. It involves more words. It's no more clear. That needs washed doesn't put any nuance, any shade of meaning into the sentence that isn't there with that needs to be washed. If I were to bet, I would say that needs washed is the one that will eventually take over, because languages like to simplify themselves. Now, that does not mean that languages become more simple over time. That's a myth. Languages don't necessarily become more complicated over time either. That's another myth. It's just that when you watch something simplifying, you can sort of follow it a little further down the road and say, ooh, I think that one is going to take over. But keep in mind, this is the same area where they use let and leave interchangeably. Let it alone, leave it alone. I've actually heard people say things like I let that party early, or he needs to leave me through the traffic. They are completely interchangeable for some people. I would say probably 80% of the people around here will use it almost completely interchangeably, but there are some ways in which they will only use let, and some sentences in which they will only use leave. But we have that. That's a local peculiarity. Is that going to take over? No, I really do not think so. It's not a grammatical error. The reason it's not is because let and leave have many meanings. It's one of those things you go into a dictionary, and you know how you have your primary meaning, your secondary meaning, and with some of these words you go down, it's like number 14, and they use it in a sentence, and you're saying, whoa, that's a lot, especially for small common words. Let and leave are like that. They both have a great many meanings, and the one that is the most common thread is allow, which is an old meaning for the words. Is that going to take over? No, I do not think so. I think that is a local peculiarity. I think let and leave, which are separate words in most of the country, are going to remain separate words. But that needs washed. If I were to bet, I would say 100 years from now, that's how we'll say it. So, do you want to do this? Do you want to do a grammar day? Do you want to be able to go into the comments and say, what about this one? What about that one? I'm not sure if this is the correct way. Do you know where that came from? Because I do, by the way. Whatever it is, I know where it came from. I do love this language, and the English language, I guess you could say that's one of my favorite hobbies. That, by the way, is my undergraduate degree. Somebody had said, will I please tell you what my undergraduate degree was in? It was in communications. I had 3 majors and 6 minors. I really like the concept of a liberal arts education. That's actually what one of my professors had said. You really like the concept of a liberal arts education, don't you? Yes. On my degree, there was only 1 major and 2 minors because they wouldn't let me put it all there. But yes, 3 majors, 6 minors, and one of the majors was, in fact, speech communications, what used to be called rhetoric. So, yeah, this is kind of my field. I really do love this. So if you've got questions, I can answer it. If this is something that's interesting to you, we can go through it. It's up to you. And I thought we would just throw this out and see what you want to do about it. Because as I started off saying, maybe this is something that we should relegate to a certain day of the week so that the people who want to look at thrift store purchasing can just say, oh gee, it's Wordy Wednesday, I'm going to skip this one. What do you say? All right, let me know in the comments. You know I want to hear from you. And I will see you on Friday.